So there's a part of what Iran's ambassador said in Beijing that almost every headline got wrong this weekend. And I want to explain to you exactly what's really happening with that Strait of Hormuz fee plan. Because once you understand the detail everyone skipped over, you're going to see this whole thing differently. Quick thing before we get into it. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to know where everyone's tuning in from today. I actually do read them. Let me take you back to Beijing this weekend. The World Peace Forum. That's where Iran's ambassador to China, Abdolreza Rahmani Fazli, stood up and dropped something that should have been a much bigger deal than it turned out to be in most of the news coverage. He said Iran is going to charge new service fees for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the U.S. has already said loudly and repeatedly that Iran will not be permitted to charge tolls or fees under any final agreement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made that crystal clear. He said it's an international waterway. No country gets to do that. And President Trump said the same thing, called it unacceptable. But here's what happened. The ambassador stood there in Beijing and he said Iran will definitely charge these service fees. And then he said something that I think is the real key to this whole thing. He said China and other friendly countries would get special consideration on these fees. Special consideration. Now ask yourself, why would he say that part out loud? Why would you announce that you're going to give some countries a break and not others, when the U.S. is already telling you that the whole plan is a non-starter? Think about it. Before we go any further, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. Because this isn't some random shipping lane. This is the most important choke point for global energy on the entire planet. Roughly a fifth of the world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas goes through that narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. A fifth. When Iran blockaded it during the war, and yes, there was a war, a real shooting war that started back in late February between Iran and the U.S. and Israel, global energy prices went absolutely insane. The strait was all but closed, ships couldn't get through, oil prices shot up, and the U.S. and Israel had launched that war to destabilize Iran's leadership and take out its missile and nuclear programs. So you have to understand how high the stakes are here. The U.S. and Iran reached an initial truce back in April, and they signed a preliminary agreement to end hostilities. That agreement says commercial ships would transit the strait free of charge for 60 days. 60 days. Which means that window is closing very, very soon. Now both sides are in negotiations for a permanent settlement, and one of the biggest sticking points, maybe the biggest, is who controls the Strait of Hormuz, and whether Iran gets to charge anything for passage. The U.S. says absolutely not. Iran says absolutely yes. And that's where we are right now. But here's the part that I think most people are missing. The ambassador didn't just say Iran would charge fees. He said Iran is working on this with Oman. Collaboration and cooperation with Oman, he said. Now, Oman is interesting because Oman sits on the other side of the strait from Iran. And Oman has been a go-between for the U.S. and Iran for years. They're the ones who shuttle messages back and forth. They're the ones who try to keep communication lines open when the two countries aren't speaking. So the fact that Iran says they're working with Oman on this matters, because Oman has already floated a proposal to the U.S. about voluntary shipping service fees. Let me say that again, voluntary shipping service fees. Oman is trying to sell this as, hey, it's not a toll, it's just a fee for services, security, supervision, environmental stuff. That's the language the Iranian ambassador used too. Service fees, not tolls. But U.S. officials aren't buying the semantics. Rubio said, you can call it a toll, you can call it a fee, whatever you want to call it. It's a game of semantics. That will never be an acceptable condition of any deal. Now, I want to point out the detail that made me lean into the screen when I first read this report. The ambassador said something really specific. He said these new arrangements would be about guaranteeing the security of passage through the strait, supervision of the vessels, and dealing with the environmental consequences of the massive number of ships going through. He's wrapping this up in a package that sounds reasonable. Safety, the environment, security. That's the argument. And then he says, we'll give special treatment to countries that were friendly to us and stood by us during the hard times. He was standing in Beijing when he said that. Think about who that message was for. China, right now, is Iran's biggest customer for oil. China kept buying Iranian crude even when the U.S. had sanctions on Tehran. China stood by Iran during the war in ways that the U.S. definitely noticed. And so the ambassador is sending a very clear signal. If you're on our side, you get a pass. You get special treatment. You don't pay what everyone else pays. And the flip side of that message is just as important. What happens to U.S. ships? What happens to Israeli ships? What happens to ships from countries that supported the U.S. in the war? They're not getting special treatment. They're getting the full fee. And that's a kind of economic warfare that doesn't require a single shot being fired. Now, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to really think about it. If Iran can charge different fees to different countries based on how friendly they are, doesn't that mean Iran gets to decide who has preferential access to one of the most important shipping lanes in the world? And doesn't that mean Iran gets to punish its enemies economically without ever firing a missile? Because that's what's on the table here. Let me take you deeper into what's actually happening behind the scenes, because I think the public statements are only half the picture. Oman has been quietly working on this proposal for a while. According to some reports, they've even put together a formal plan modeled on something similar in the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. In that arrangement, a private foundation collects voluntary contributions for safe navigation. It's not a toll, it's a contribution, voluntary. But Iran's officials have already said the payments would be obligatory. So right away, you've got a disagreement between Iran and Oman on how this would actually work. And here's where it gets really messy. Oman has said charging transit fees would be illegal. That's their foreign minister's position. But they've also said there's a difference between a transit fee and a fee for services provided by the countries along the strait. So they're trying to split a hair very finely. And the U.S. is saying there is no hair to split. A fee is a fee is a fee, and it's not happening. Now think about Iran's position. They argued that the Strait of Hormuz is part of their territorial waters. That's a disputed claim, but they're sticking to it. And they're saying, as a country where the Hormuz is part of its territorial waters, we will definitely charge service fees. They're not asking permission. They're stating a fact. From their perspective, this is happening. But there's something else going on here. Something that I think gets to the heart of what Iran is really doing. Iran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said something a few weeks ago that I keep coming back to. He said the Strait of Hormuz will never return to the pre-war status quo. Never. So no matter what the U.S. says, no matter what the negotiations produce, Iran is not going back to the way things were before. They have tasted what it's like to control that choke point. They have seen what it does to global energy prices. They have experienced the leverage that comes with being able to close one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. And they're not giving that up. They're just trying to figure out how to institutionalize it in a way that the world will accept. But the world isn't accepting it. At least the U.S. isn't. And most of the Gulf states aren't either. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said the strait must return to the status quo before the war. He asked, why should we now, as a result of a conflict, accept some novel arrangement that is going to be imposed on it? So you've got Iran on one side, the U.S. and most Gulf states on the other, and Oman trying to find some middle ground. Oman is doing what Oman always does, trying to keep the peace, trying to be the bridge, trying to avoid being crushed between the two bigger powers. But here's the problem. Oman is on the other side of that strait. They have to live with whatever arrangement is made. So they're not going to just roll over for the U.S., but they're also not going to fully support Iran. They're walking a razor's edge right now. Now, I want to talk about what this means for the negotiations. The U.S. and Iran are supposed to be working toward a permanent peace settlement. They have a 60-day window that started when they signed that initial agreement back in June. That window is ticking down, and Iran is using the strait as leverage in those negotiations. That's what this is really about. It's a bargaining chip, a very, very powerful one. The U.S. has said Iran will not be allowed to charge tolls or fees under any final agreement. That's the red line. But Iran is saying we're going to do it anyway, and we're going to make exceptions for our friends. Which means one of two things. Either Iran is bluffing, and this is a negotiation tactic to get something else, or they are dead serious, and they're willing to blow up the negotiations over this issue. And if they're willing to blow up the negotiations, then we're looking at a very different situation, because the war could resume. The blockade could come back. Global oil prices could spike again, and all of the progress that was made over the past couple of months could vanish overnight. But here's the third option, and this is the one that I think is actually the most likely based on what I'm seeing. Iran isn't bluffing about the fees, but they're also not going to force a confrontation with the U.S. if they don't have to. What they want is a negotiated settlement that recognizes their control over the strait in some form. They want the U.S. to acknowledge that Iran has a say in what happens there, and they're using the threat of unilateral action to force the U.S. to the table. The special treatment for China and other friendly countries is part of that. It's a message to the U.S. that if you don't play ball with us, we'll just cut our own deals with your allies, or at least with countries that aren't your allies. We'll let them through cheaply or for free, and your ships and your allies' ships will pay the price. That's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's actually quite clever. But there's another dimension to this that I want to explore with you. Iran is talking about this in the context of the war. They're saying these countries stood by us during the hard times. That's a reference to the war with the U.S. and Israel. And China was definitely on the sidelines in a way that was favorable to Iran. They didn't actively support Iran militarily, but they continued to buy oil. They continued their economic relationship. They didn't join the sanctions. They didn't condemn Iran. From Iran's perspective, that's friendship. That's standing by them. So when the ambassador says China and other friendly countries get special treatment, he's signaling a new era in Iran's foreign policy. One where loyalty during wartime gets rewarded in peacetime, and where the U.S. is not the only game in town. Iran has options. They have friends, and they are building a new economic order that doesn't depend on American approval. Now ask yourself this: how does the U.S. respond to that? Because if Iran can just ignore what the U.S. says and start charging fees based on political loyalty, what happens to U.S. credibility? What happens to the message that the U.S. is the guarantor of freedom of navigation in international waters? That's not a small thing. That's the foundation of U.S. naval power and global influence. And that's why Rubio is so firm on this. It's not just about the money. It's about the principle. If Iran gets away with this, what's to stop other countries from doing the same thing? What's to stop Turkey from charging fees to pass through the Bosphorus? What's to stop Egypt from charging even more for the Suez Canal? That's the chaos Rubio warned about when he talked about this in Bahrain. So the U.S. can't back down, and Iran can't back down, which means we have a real problem, a genuine conflict of interest that can't be fudged or papered over. Let me take you to the scene of the announcement for a minute. The World Peace Forum in Beijing. That's not an accidental choice of venue. Iran's ambassador could have announced this in Tehran, could have done it in a press release, could have said it in Oman. But he chose Beijing. He chose the Chinese capital. And the message was as much for the Chinese audience as it was for the world. Because China is the key here. China is the customer. China is the ally. China is the one that Iran needs to keep happy. And Iran is essentially saying to China, we will treat you differently than the Americans treat you. We will give you a better deal. We will remember who our real friends are. Now, China hasn't officially responded to this, not in public anyway, but you have to imagine the Chinese officials are thinking about this very carefully. On the one hand, they want free and open shipping lanes. They need oil. Their economy runs on it. On the other hand, they don't want to upset the U.S. more than necessary. And they definitely don't want to be seen as endorsing Iran's claim of territorial waters or the right to charge fees. But China also has a long-term interest in shifting the global order away from U.S. dominance. And anything that weakens U.S. control over strategic choke points, that's something China is going to look at with a lot of interest. They might not say it out loud, but they're watching. They're always watching. So let me paint you the picture that I think is forming. Iran and Oman create a new arrangement for the Strait. It's service fees, not tolls. And yes, I know that's a distinction without a difference, but they're going to use that language anyway. And under this arrangement, ships from countries that are friendly to Iran get reduced fees. Maybe they're partially waived. Maybe they're deferred. Maybe they're lower than market rates. We don't know the specifics yet, but we know the special treatment is coming. And the U.S. gets to decide